here with? It's Misha Rose.
And I'm Luna.
So today we're going to go on an adventure. Oh, meow, 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 meow. Hey, it's Sister Rose, and I'm exploring this lost forest. Look at these giant ferns. Look at these traces of an ancient Irish civilization. I guess the fair folk sat on these or something. I don't know. Did you hear that? What animal do you think made that noise? I think there's something behind me. Shit. Before I can. Part 0. Prologue. The Little Mermaid was a literary fairy tale penned by Hans Christian Andersen in the 1830s. While best known for its Disney adaptation, it's also known for its original ending, where Ariel, or Sirenetta in some versions, spoilers, dies at the end. As such, like with Beauty and the Beast and other Disney properties, and other fairy tales in general, other kinds of classic stories, kids stories, stuff you grew up with as a kid in general, a lot of hot takers like to double down on the perceived darker or problematic elements present in the original tales or between the lines in the Disney versions. There's a problem with this though. Technically the mermaid doesn't die at the end, but becomes a sylph. The dying at the end version was present in the original publication, but, and here's the crazy fun twist, this was somewhat unintentional, as Andersen's initial script was always supposed to contain that ending. In fact, The Little Mermaid was originally called Daughters of the Air, emphasizing the full cycle the mermaid goes through from sea to land to air. It's also widely believed that The Little Mermaid may have been born from Andersen reflecting on his own homosexuality, as it was written around the same time as Andersen scribed a number of letters towards male infatuation, Edward Cullen, who was to be wedded to a young woman. In this context, the original published ending was a sort of proto-bury your gaze, and Andersen's own reflections on the revised ending, more in line with his original story, was to be more hopeful. So in a sense, these edgier versions of The Little Mermaid people envision in between penning the new chapter of their Jeff the Killer fanfic are even more silly on reflection. They're a twist on an original version that never really existed. They're what you might call a simulacrum. Also, I like the Disney version better because it has a prequel where Sebastian runs an underground jazz club. So today I thought I'd do something a bit different since I've been trying and failing to make a number of other videos and really want to get this out there while it's still somewhat relevant. So today I'm going to talk to you about how great a movie based on Dora the Explorer is. Yay! I could do a proper analysis or critique of it, I guess, but really right now I'm just feeling positive vibes about this whole thing, and I want to talk about what the adaptation gets right. But moreover, I want to talk about what other adaptations get wrong, and sort of throw in here and there a little thing where Dora is actually pretty surprising and apt for an adaptation. I'm actually going to do parts in this for once, because I was told having highly structured video essays is the way to go, but usually my thought process is too non-linear and possibly non-Euclidean to do this. But, well, part 1. The art of the adult adaptation. So the idea of how to adapt a difficult source material has always been a point of contention for the likes of comic book movies or video games. During the 90s, largely thanks to the Super Mario Bros. Movie, which probably represented the pinnacle of the Hollywood adaptation, the idea of something being a loose and somewhat gritty adaptation of a source material with a "we execs in suit know how to do this weird thing better than you nerds" kind of became a big thing. Marvel's Ultimate Comics imprint was largely set up to give Hollywood better material to work with, and tended to follow the formula of an edgier Hollywood adaptation. The Green Goblin was a big hulking mutant, Nick Fury was Samuel L. Jackson, and so on. I suppose we're sort of tempted to say, well, if they're going to make things weirdly Hollywood to begin with, then we can at least try and nudge them towards the less cringy examples in that possibility space. It was also a natural continuation of the deconstruction era comics beginning in the 80s with the likes of Watchmen and The Dark Knight, which also has a lot to do with the underlying tropes of darker and edgier in general. The idea of an ultimate version of something entered the nerd consciousness, sort of a couple of steps below a full-on twisted childhood reboot, like what if the Rugrats were actually dead. I don't know. Or something like The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, which is a more mature take on the comic, I guess. Or a general more mature, modern, cinematic take on something. Like the MCU after it, a lot of people getting into Marvel at the time found the Ultimate Comics more accessible, but also kind of more streamlined and even all round improved when compared to the 616 books they may have struggled to get into with their years and years of continuity. The problem with this school of adaptation, which by no means started with Ultimate Marvel but is in many ways typified by it, is that it often had issues homogenizing everything, or when it did try to be different in new ways, somehow sucking the character out of the original and missing the mark. Galactus, the ultimate version of Galactus, being an example of that, doubly so the cinematic adaptation in Rise of the Silver Surfer, which was a cloud. There's some sort of mundane weirdness to all this. Its attempts to be more mature and sometimes more realistic end up being more cringy and teenage very often. And they're also very much from a certain perspective, like a very male gaze, cis, white, whatever. It's from a particular point of view that it is realistic and edgy. Adaptations like the aforementioned Chilling Adventures of Sabrina often try to find their own aesthetic or role with the more adult nature of its adaptation, in more fun and campy ways. But again, it also has examples of shortfalls, particularly on how a supposedly more modern and aware adaptation can show a distinct lack of awareness of the reality of marginalized groups. And this was an issue in The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina with its depictions, particularly of black witches. And that leads us into part 2.
Part 2. Hyperreality.
In an essay called I'm Being So Sincere Right Now, Quinney talks about games such as Vampire the Masquerades as a form of hyperreality. The depiction of what was considered adult themes, such as the presence of sex workers, is considered by a certain demographic to make it inherently more mature, but often ends up being infantile and inaccurate in its interpretations of these issues due to a lack of relevant perspective. In the Ultimate Comics, they portray the relationship between Hank Pym and Janet Van Dyne in a really uncomfortable way, where Hank actually uses his giant man powers to be a really big wife beater. Well, Hank is a controversial character anyway due to the actions of his Yellow Jacket persona. The idea that this is taking the issue more seriously than the original is defeated by the sheer ludicrous feeling the situation gives off. Oh, and Hulk eats people now, because why not? Hyperreality as a concept was probably first popularized by sociologist, cultural theorist, and philosopher Jean Baudrilard, which is my best attempt at pronouncing a French name. But anyway, we're dropping philosophy in a Dora the Effing Explorer video, so good on you, Mr. Baudrilard, for giving me some relevant theory to shove in a video of something about a cartoon. Hyperreality is a sort of representation of something that doesn't really exist, but manages to convince people that it does, and often comes about by way of exaggerating or distorting something that does exist, until it becomes unrecognizable. Baudrillard defines this process as having 4 steps. Number 1, basic reflection of reality. Number 2, perversion of reality. Number 3, pretense of reality, of which there is no true model. And number 4 is the simulacrum, which bears no relation to any reality whatsoever. It's a sort of Rob Liefeld approach to representing things, like how Rob learned to draw from already exaggerated superhero art. Nerds who write this stuff are generally basing on stuff written by other edgy nerds, who base it off this one thing their cousin swears he saw in the back alleys one time when he was high. I used to play RPGs with a pair of nerds that were kind of like this, and they outright told me I couldn't play a character in Cyberpunk who looked and dressed like Marvel's Tigra because how she dressed would get her assaulted. It's an interpretation of reality formed via Chinese whispers, which is fitting since that term in of itself is thought to be founded on a lack of cultural understanding on behalf of Westerners who are at the time trying to contact and do trade with the East, which is likely a factor that leads into the Orientalism also surrounding this. Hyperreality is a common theme in Orientalism. A musician and podcaster Blind by Book Club often gives the tiki bar as an example of a Baudrillardian hyperreal simulacrum. The genre space that Dora and the Lost City of Gold occupies is in of itself rife with hyperreal Orientalism. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, for example, or any number of uses of Latin American, Aztec, or Incan pastiches. Not only is Dora a movie that avoids a lot of the hyperreality associated with mature updates, it also somehow combats the hyperreal simulacrums associated with their culture. which was generically Latinx in the cartoon but was heavily implied to be Peruvian in the movie. It's not perfect and it still relies on some media friendly tropes to draw people in, but it's definitely a step up from a lot of adaptations of things that involve sort of South American or Latinx culture that would be more exotified or more rife with the usual native stereotypes. As I mentioned in the previous part, hyperreality tends to be particularly problematic when it comes to marginalized groups. I already mentioned how depictions of sex workers instantly makes the work more adult, even if their handling of them is unrealistic and childish. And this also applies to trans people, Muslims, and other marginalized groups, which I can account for a little bit more. We see this a lot in things that take after Frank Miller's work in particular. Dora itself isn't exactly what I call an SJW movie, but it's important to relate to it this concept of hyperreality for a number of adjacent reasons. Do you remember those awful How Disney Princesses End Up photoshops from a while back, and how Jasmine ended up depicted as some kind of terrorist come Mad Max wasteland warrior? I mean, if you're going to do a more adult adaptation of Jasmine, you could at least use this awesome Battle Jasmine from the 4th Ed player handbook. I think it can be easy to forget how important Dora is as a media figure, as she helped on some level normalize the idea of a Latinx lead or point of view character for children. While Dora occupies a surreal world in the cartoon, it's not necessarily a hyper-real one. This show tries to be a respectful depiction of a Latina girl and works in little bits of Spanish or Hispanic culture where it can. Being a kids' cartoon, of course, it can't be judged on accuracy in quite the same way, and it does still rely on a lot of pastiches to get across its stories. But the main point here is less that, and more the use of hyperreality to depict a world that's more real than reality, where real means more dark and edgy. It can be hard to challenge this idea of hyperreality because hyperreality depicts itself by nature as the ultimate reality, the red pill, or the black pill, I guess, that once seen cannot be unseen. Once you're clued into the bleakest levels of reality, you can't go back, and you can only really see other dark and depressing art as true and worthy of merit, even if you are personally sheltered from a lot of that darkness by your privilege and don't understand it or even where it really lies to begin with. While it's a somewhat cynical thing in of itself, hyperreality has thankfully unseated itself as the dominant force in nerd adaptations. This can be seen in the shift towards positive reception to movies like Aquaman and Shazam as opposed to Suicide Squad and Batman vs Superman. And when I say unseated itself, I mean largely because of those adaptations, making it a bit of a joke. And while it's ending soon, titles like The Unbeatable Squirrel Girl and really Squirrel Girl's character as a whole sort of help stave off the self-seriousness of many of the big Marvel crossovers and other edgy comics. Fun is cool again, sort of. Edgy reboots are the stuff of mockery now, largely because people have somewhat clued into how utterly self-absorbed and obnoxious they can be, as well as how much they miss the spirit of the originals and don't necessarily add anything new to replace that. So as you might have gathered, this isn't really what Dora does at all in its movie adaptation. Some people might have gotten the impression from the leaked excerpts from the Dora novel adaptation that it does sort of go down that road, and you'd be happy to hear that those actual passages are not, first of all, actually from an official book, and secondly, not that unreflective of the content of the movie itself, but actually something different is going on here. Yes, it pokes the fun at a lot of stuff that makes the cartoon weird to adults, and yeah, its depiction of high school is a little exaggerated and yeah, a bit hyper-real in itself. But what happens when you take a somewhat hyper-real version of American high school and yeet in a cartoon character for 4-year-olds?
Part 3. Have courage and be kind.
Dora and the Lost City of Gold, in all honesty, feels like an extended college humour sketch for much of its runtime. It really does feel like someone made this movie on a dare, or after losing a game of slaps around the back of the sheds with the boys from the studio. But, and this is important, while it may in some ways resemble a parody or farce, at no point is it fully or truly mean-spirited towards the original. I'm thinking of how, in the last season of Jessica Jones, they had Patsy make fun of and discard a comic book accurate outfit of her persona Hellcat. This felt like a rehash of the season 1 joke where Jessica is presented with the Jewel costume from the comics again, and mocks it and decides not to wear it. But the thing is, this makes no sense. The Alias comic was already a deconstruction and already took an edgy position on superhero tropes. That costume only happened to appear in the flashbacks that showed the contrast with her current life. The adaptation ends up suffering from this because it sort of misses the point of the original, even though it echoes a lot of its edgy sentiments. And largely because there's so little difference between Jessica Jones as a street superhero and Jessica Jones as a totally not superhero who sometimes helps people by punching things. All she did was dial it back a bit. It doesn't feel so tragic and self-defeaty like in the comics. It feels more like taking a self-care sabbatical. On some level, the Netflix Marvel stuff was so ashamed of being a superhero franchise that it couldn't even depict one of their leads wearing a serious superhero outfit as a joke. It's like toxic masculinity, except with insecure writers and producers in denial of their nerdhood. Toxic nerdhood, everybody, because the world needs less fun, apparently. It's the superhero equivalent of a no homo, except in this case, it's a no homo on top of a no homo, which sounds pretty gay if you ask me. And the thing is that both gay things and superhero things are often collectively referred to as camp in different ways, along with musicals and other things. So that's not really a coincidence. What's really weird is when it applies even to women. Jessica Jones has a female showrunner, and how they internalize a lot of the same disdain for fun versus how much a movie like Dora doesn't is really interesting. Jessica Jones couldn't let a character like Patsy Walker really exist, despite picking her specifically over any number of other characters that could have filled a similar role. The whole point of Patsy, as she is now in the comics, is that she's been through some real crap, and actually manages to remain quite upbeat, despite literally being to hell and back, but still happens to be one of Marvel's stable of more upbeat, perky people like Kamala Khan or Squirrel Girl. She's a real underdog, having a limited power set but keeping on trooping. While I enjoyed the Jessica Jones show overall, it didn't really do a good job of showing its protagonist's healing. I keep contrasting it while writing this to Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, where the main character did own up to a lot of the shit their trauma made them do. Or, comics Jessica Jones, where she stops being a total jerk to everyone, and even comes full circle as she lets Squirrel Girl babysit her kid. It's like Squirrel Girl is begging me to turn into some sort of weird, sort of Jungian archetype for fun is a good thing, actually. Now, it's important to remember that the usual dude nerds hated the last Hellcat comic, and a lot of them are really iffy on the Squirrel Girl comic, which occupies a similar, unbearably positive region of superhero thought space. It is curious, by the way, how many diverse comics or female-heavy comics do tend to have a bit more of a positive bent. Probably because, despite all this rubbish about escapism from the anti-SJW crowd and how, oh no, comics are just about escapism, video games are about escapism, we can't be thinking about politics. But we're the ones who most need to escape to a fantasy world where our best friend is a squirrel. The central sort of strife in Dora and the Lost City of Gold kind of comes from this juxtaposition. Dora is someone who never really grew up, due to a lack of exposure to the cultural norms that pressure teens to act cool and inject the marijuanas. The movie does poke a bit of fun at Dora's oddness throughout much of the movie, but ultimately it's not her that looks bad in the end. It's her cousin Diego who comes off as more of a jerk for not standing up for her early on. It can be difficult to understand exactly what the movie is trying to say here, but it becomes more and more obvious as it goes along and the story evolves, so we realise Dora isn't stupid and unaware of her surroundings, just uncompromising, and seeing her in her element as a jungle explorer helps her castmates understand her better. Dora and the Lost City of Gold isn't really unkind to its main character or even the source material that it's adapting. It's too easy to take a dump on kids stuff like this, as the countless Peppa Pig YouTube poops will attest to. Seriously, there's a lot of these. Peppa Pig drinks bleach, I'm not going to go on. In the post-Elsagate world, Dora is a breath of fresh air, as it confronts some teen/adult difficulties and touches on some darker themes like colonialism, but ultimately overpowers the shadow of those themes and manages to be somewhat positive. It's a sort of hope punk movie. Unlike most aspirational be yourself sort of affairs, which it also kind of fits into a little bit, there's something more meaningful about it in the way it does poke at Dora's internal world for being unrealistic, that it does acknowledge some hurtful realities. It sets up a world that suggests Dora's optimistic fantasy is just that, a fantasy, and builds her up again from there. So it has more of a feeling of a getting my groove back sort of film than the typical aspirational one. It doesn't really get particularly dark at any point, but it's still just a tad less saccharine than a lot of Disney Channel movies, but a sprinkle sweeter than Young Justice Season 3. Dora and the Lost City of Gold both works as a joke film and manages to be more respectful than a lot of comic book adaptations that are ashamed of what they are. I took the title of this section from one of the better live-action Disney adaptations, probably one of the few that was in some way needed due to the sheer age of the original, and by needed I mean like there is room for an adaptation of something that old and that may invoke a lot of very 50s tropes. And while the adaptation didn't break all that much ground, it does still sum up the correct approach to modernizing and adapting things like this inadvertently, that one quote. Be bold with it, don't be boring, but don't try to do that by kicking over the original. If this film can have respect for a cartoon with a singing map, then James Gunn can show some goddamn respect for Mantis.
Part 4. Explorers, not treasure hunters.
But seriously though, a Dora movie? Are you really going to tell me to go see a Dora movie? What next? A Peppa Pig MMO? Yes, you should go see the Dora movie. I'm not saying you'll definitely like it, or it's the best movie of the year, or it's not without its problems, but it really is better than it has a right to be. I really feel like it's worth watching just for a lesson in how to have fun with adapting something that sounds like one of the suggestions for a cool thing Ryan North writes at the bottom of a page in Unbeatable Squirrel Girl. Also, you should read The Unbeatable Squirrel Girl so you can understand that reference. Okay, so why watch the movie? Well, for a start, the cast is pretty damn good, for the most part, and goes out of its way to cast Latinx actors. Isabella Monares is delighted as the titular Dora. I got Louis from Ant-Man, Michael Pena, being generally great in it. The movie is enjoyable for kids, teens, and adults alike, as it captures different aspects of their experiences in different ways. The movie actually manages to have a real sense of stakes and danger to it in parts, while never losing its sense of fun. It gets a lot of little heartfelt moments as well, like Dora seeking comfort from her abuelita, and a lot of good visual gags, and some just really bizarre stuff, which is the main reason I went to see it, to be honest. If you've seen those League Junior novel excerpts, no, they're not an artifact of that particular adaptation that got past the editors. The movie plays with source material and genre tropes in some pretty wild and fun ways that are reflected in that. The movie also takes a bit of a nice little stab at colonialism more than once through the movie, particularly listing off all the different colonial powers that have exploited Latin America at one point or another. While it doesn't really do much to tackle things like racism head on, it's still nice to see a movie that's aware of these things, given how utterly Hollywood glosses over them. This brings us to the movie's central thesis, or at least what makes it relevant to this section, which is the dichotomy of the explorer and the treasure hunter. While this can be seen exclusively in the context of the colonial snapping of artifacts, we see these themes reflected a lot elsewhere. Dora is a social explorer who introduced herself to everyone and anyone, and attempts against all odds to socialise in this manner as opposed to playing the typical teen games that help one amass social capital. The contrast to Dora's explorer is Sammy's treasure hunter, who has this more exploitative approach to popularity in the beginning, and in how Diego abandons his own cousin for popularity. There are sort of two archetypal themes here, and I think it covers a lot of the issues inherent in Orientalism and cultural appropriation. An explorer is set up early in the movie to be someone who quests for knowledge, who studies and appreciates the cultures around them. This is seen in Dora and her parents studying Incan culture, as opposed to the treasure hunters relying on their hard work to get the treasure. Now, having no concern for the cultural and historical significance of Pata Pata, the titular city of gold, past how much bank they can make of it. It seems a bit forced and corny at first, but it makes sense more as it goes along, and as I said, I feel like it's also a useful thought form in distincting cultural appropriation from cultural appreciation. I'm also going to address some of the stuff I've seen in other YouTube videos online, or actually one point in particular. First, the idea that the movie doesn't teach you anything, like at least a TV show does that, even though it's for kids, and that sort of rings false to me. You do actually learn some cool factoids, like the idea that Incans actually had some pretty advanced plumbing and aqueducts, and how to escape quicksand, which I think is somewhat accurate. I'm not really sure, but I intend to use that information to impress the GM next time we're like stuck in a jungle adventure. Also, a Peppa Pig MMO could totally be the new Club Penguin if you like age up the characters a bit and make it more of a typical Anthro thing, draw the furries in. If anyone wants to pay me for this idea, my paypal.me is in the description.
Conclusion.
Adapting material and ideas from one medium, or even worse, one demographic to another, can be an incredibly tricky process and very much an art over a science. Dora both manages to capture the humour and absurdity inherent in a live-action teen Dora movie, But instead of being mean about it, it goes on to say, but yeah, this is actually kind of genuinely cool also. Characters like Teen Dora and Squirrel Girl are important to stop us taking ourselves too seriously, and minus that being silly doesn't mean you can't also be cool and important. Dora might sing and dance and act a bit like a kid, but it doesn't make her less of a person. And neither does it make you less mature or less of a man-woman NB friend for liking cuteness. It's also reflective of the modern philosophy of radical softness as a weapon, as Dora expresses awareness of her own weirdness but refuses to harden to conform to the others around her. And what I'm saying is we should be like Dora or Patsy Walker or Kamala Khan. I'm sure I'll repeat this while making a full on Hope Pink video, and I already talked about this in my treading water video, but the co-creator of Kamala Khan, G. Willow Wilson, once did a talk where she shared one of her favourite sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. Peace be upon him. It varies from account to translation, but it goes something like this. If you have in your hand a seed or a branch thing, and the last day is upon you, plant the seed. By pitting Dora against the edgy tropes of edgier teen adaptations and rising above them, by standing out as a movie about explorers and not treasure hunters, Dora is a movie that tries to plant seeds. Finally, I thought I'd throw in a quote from Danny Trejo, who makes a guest appearance in the movie, when he remarks on the conception of the Machete series, another movie franchise spun out of, well, kind of a joke actually. There were many action movies that with a Latin flavour could play to a broad audience. When I watched director John Woo's movies, they made me want to be Asian. Woo and actor Chow Yun-fat's Hard-Boiled and The Killer really inspired me to make films that would create that feeling in the Latin arena. While this is maybe worded a bit problematically, I feel like he hits on something here. Properties like Dora are important for reasons like this, to normalise different forms of representation and to let other people be the hero. Dora is a movie with a Peruvian lead actress adventuring around a Peruvian jungle solving Incan puzzles. It's still somewhat of a Western gaze movie and a product of capitalism, under no illusions of that. But the fact that it manages to be an action heavy movie led by a woman of colour, a young woman of colour, is pretty important. Honestly, this would be a great launching pad for a franchise. I feel like movies could do with a new quality YA thing that has actual life and spark to it, and having Dora be the new Indiana Jones just seems really damn cool in an absurd and unexpected way. So anyway, in conclusion, I really want there to be a sequel so Swiper the Fox can get a redemption arc.